In 1815, Nathan Rothschild knew Napoleon had lost at Waterloo 24 hours before the British government. But here is what the conspiracy theories get wrong. He did not crash the market. He did not deceive anyone. He had something far more valuable than insider information. He had infrastructure. This is the story of how one family built the 19th century internet and why they lost it. Frankfurt, 1744. A boy named Meyer Amschel is born into a world where geography determines destiny. He lives in the Judengasse, a single narrow street where Jews are confined by law. 3,000 people within 400 meters, gates locked at night and on Christian holidays. No property rights, no citizenship, no path to power except one: money. The restrictions were suffocating. Jews could not own land. They could not join guilds. They could not practice most professions. But they could lend money. In a world where the Catholic Church prohibited usury among Christians, someone had to provide credit. That someone was the Jewish money lender. It was a despised profession. It was also the only one available. But here is what made Frankfurt different from every other confined community in Europe. It sat at the crossroads of continental trade. Merchants from 30 nations passed through its annual fairs. Information flowed through Frankfurt like water through a river delta. And Meyer Amschel Rothschild watched every single one of them. By the age of 20, he had figured out something that would define his family for 2 centuries. Money has no religion. A loan is a loan. And powerful people need liquidity more than they need ideology. His first major client was William IX, Landgrave of Hesse-Kassel. William had one of the strangest businesses in 18th century Europe. He rented out his army. When the British needed soldiers to fight in America, William supplied them. At his peak, he commanded over 12,000 mercenaries and collected a fortune in rental fees. The Hessians who fought against George Washington's army were William's employees. William needed someone to manage that money, someone who could not threaten his position, someone who was legally prohibited from owning land or holding office, someone who would remain permanently dependent on his patronage. He needed someone discreet. He chose Meyer Amschel Rothschild. Rothschild became the man for the job. By 1800, the Rothschilds were handling transfers worth over £3 million. But Meyer understood something William did not. Wealth concentrated in one place is vulnerable. Wealth distributed across borders is untouchable. He had 5 sons. He placed them in 5 cities: Frankfurt, Vienna, London, Naples, Paris. Each brother ran an independent banking house. Each used a different currency. Each answered to a different government. But they all answered to each other. The family crest became 5 arrows bound together. The motto: Concordia, Integritas, Industria. Unity, integrity, industry. But the real meaning was simpler. You can break 1 arrow. You cannot break 5. This was the first multinational corporation, not in structure, but in spirit. Before the Rothschilds, wealth was local. After them, wealth was everywhere and nowhere. A loan issued in London could be serviced in Paris. Assets seized in Vienna could be replaced from Naples. No single government could touch them, because no single government could find them. But for Meyer, this was just the beginning. Meyer Amschel died in 1812. His 3rd son, Nathan, had already moved to London and was about to change European history. Not through politics, not through war, through something no one else thought to build: a private communication network faster than any government on earth. Nathan's system was elegant in its simplicity. He employed couriers on permanent salary. He kept boats in every major channel port. He trained carrier pigeons that could cross the channel in 5 hours. He established relay stations where horses waited, rested, fed, and were ready to run at any hour of the day or night. The British government sent dispatches through official channels. Messages passed through bureaucracies, waited for approvals, sat in queues. A dispatch from a battlefield had to go through military command, then diplomatic channels, then customs, and finally to London. Nathan's messages went direct. No intermediaries, no delays, no oversight. By 1815, a government dispatch from Paris to London took a minimum of 3 days. A Rothschild message took 30 hours. That 20-hour gap was worth millions. Here is how the system worked in practice. Every Rothschild brother had agents in every major European city. Those agents reported to each other in coded correspondence. The code changed weekly. The routes changed monthly. Even if a message was intercepted, it was meaningless without the current cipher. Information traveled in one direction, toward the brother who could profit from it. Grain prices in Odessa reached London before they reached Berlin. Political gossip from the Vienna court reached Paris before it reached the newspapers. Ship movements, crop failures, diplomatic tensions. Everything that moved markets, the Rothschilds knew first. This was not espionage. This was logistics. The Rothschilds did not steal information. They simply received it first. And in markets, first is everything. Now we come to Waterloo. June 18th, 1815. Napoleon faces Wellington in Belgium. The outcome will determine the future of Europe, and everyone in London is waiting. Legend. Says Nathan Rothschild received news of Napoleon's defeat first, then spread false rumors of a French victory to crash the British bond market. In the chaos, he bought government bonds at pennies on the pound. When the truth emerged, bond prices soared, and Nathan made a fortune through deception. Everyone thinks they know this story. Manipulation, lies, ruthless exploitation of public fear. But the truth is even more fascinating. This myth first appeared in an 1846 pamphlet written to discredit Jewish financiers. The author used the pen name Satan. His real name was Georges Derneville. He was a French journalist who made no attempt to hide his hatred of Jews and the Rothschilds in particular. The pamphlet has been repeated in anti-Semitic literature for nearly 200 years. Modern historians have thoroughly debunked it. Here is what actually happened. Nathan did receive news of the victory early. His courier reached London on June 20th, more than 24 hours before official government dispatches arrived on June 21st. Nathan went immediately to the British Treasury and reported the victory. He did not hide the information. He gave it away. So why did bond prices not immediately spike? Because nobody believed him. The government's own information said the battle outcome was still unclear. Nathan Rothschild was a foreigner, a financier, a man with obvious motive to manipulate markets. Why would anyone trust his word over official channels? They did not, and Nathan knew they would not. So while the government verified his information through their own agonizingly slow process, Nathan quietly purchased government bonds. Not through deception, through superior's intelligence and justified confidence in his own network. When the official news arrived 24 hours later, bond prices rose sharply. Nathan's purchases, made at pre-confirmation prices, generated substantial profits. His profits from bond purchases and commissions on British war financing ran into the hundreds of thousands of pounds, enough to double the family's collective wealth within a single year. The lesson is not that Nathan cheated. The lesson is that infrastructure beats information. Everyone eventually learned Napoleon lost. Only Nathan was positioned to act on it immediately. His network was the 1815 version of the internet. Not the information itself, but the speed of its transmission. Whoever moves fastest wins, even when everyone has access to the same facts. Speed and networks matter, but they can be replicated and outgrown. 60 years later, the Rothschilds demonstrated this principle again. In 1875, the Khedive of Egypt needed money desperately. He offered to sell his shares in the Suez Canal. The buyer who moved first would control the most strategic waterway on Earth. Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli wanted those shares for Britain. But Parliament was in recess. There was no mechanism for rapid government financing of this scale. The purchase price was £4 million, roughly 400 million in today's currency. Disraeli sent a single message to Lionel de Rothschild, Nathan's son. The response came the same day. "You shall have it. No committee, no approval process, no delay." 48 hours later, Britain controlled the Suez Canal, and the Rothschilds held the debt. The interest alone generated returns for decades. This was the family's peak. By the 1870s, N.M. Rothschild and Sons functioned as the global lender of last resort. When European governments faced currency crises, they came to the Rothschilds. When central banks needed emergency liquidity, they came to the Rothschilds. The family stabilized currencies from Brazil to Russia. In 1825, they had even supplied the Bank of England with gold bullion during a liquidity crisis, effectively rescuing Britain's central bank. They weren't a shadow government. They were something more useful, a financial utility, too important to exclude, too valuable to attack. But even the most powerful man in finance can't defeat the ultimate enemy. Nathan Mayer Rothschild died in 1836, aged 58. His sons inherited his network, his capital, and his contacts. They did not inherit his instincts. The problem was not incompetence. The problem was scale. Nathan built a system designed for a world of 5 major European powers and slow communication. His sons inherited a world of industrializing nations, transcontinental expansion, and technologies that were about to make the Rothschild advantage obsolete. In 1866, the first permanent transatlantic telegraph cable began operation. A message that once took weeks by ship now took minutes. The Rothschilds' pigeon network was not just slower by comparison. It was irrelevant. By 1880, new competitors had emerged who understood the changing landscape. J.P. Morgan's in New York, Deutsche Bank in Berlin, Credit Lyonnais in Paris. These were not family firms. They were institutions. They had access to the same telegraph lines as everyone else. They had something the Rothschilds lacked: unlimited appetite for scale. The Rothschilds had always limited their risk by limiting their size. They could fund a canal purchase or stabilize a currency, but they could not finance a railroad from coast to coast or underwrite an entire nation's industrialization. That required capital beyond any family's capacity. By 1900, J.P. Morgan controlled more American capital than all 5 Rothschild houses combined. The family remained wealthy. They remained influential. But they were no longer first. Then came the catastrophes. World War I created financial demands that exceeded the capacity of any private bank. Governments that once borrowed from the Rothschilds now printed money, issued public bonds, and built central banks to manage their own monetary systems. The scale of modern warfare had outgrown private finance entirely. The International Monetary Fund, established in 1944, institutionalized the lender of last resort function the Rothschilds had once monopolized. What one family had invented, an international organization, now performed with vastly greater resources. World War II brought direct destruction. In 1938, Nazi Germany annexed Austria. The Vienna Rothschilds lost everything. Palaces, artwork, financial assets worth hundreds of millions were confiscated by the Third Reich. Louis von Rothschild spent over a year imprisoned before his family secured his release through payment of an enormous ransom. The regime systematically stripped Austrian Jewish families of their property. The Rothschilds were not exceptions. They were targets. Centuries of accumulated wealth vanished in months. The London and Paris houses survived the war but emerged into a transformed world. The Bretton Woods system created new rules for international finance. Government institutions now performed functions the Rothschilds had invented. The family's competitive advantage, speed through private networks, meant nothing when everyone had access to instantaneous global communication. Here's where the modern conspiracy theories break down. If the Rothschilds controlled the world, why did they lose so much of it? When Benjamin de Rothschild died in 2021, his estimated net worth was $1.4 billion. Substantial by any normal measure, but not even close to the world's wealthiest individuals. Jeff Bezos is worth over $150 billion. Elon Musk fluctuates above $200 billion. The Rothschild family's combined wealth, spread across dozens of descendants in multiple countries, totals perhaps $20 to $25 billion by the most generous estimates. They rank nowhere near the top of global rich lists. A family that supposedly controls world finance is worth less than a single American who sells books online. The math does not support the myth. What the Rothschilds actually demonstrate is something more interesting than conspiracy. They show what happens when a competitive advantage disappears. For 50 years, Nathan Rothschild's network was untouchable. No government, no competitor, no rival could match his speed. But speed was never a permanent advantage. It was a temporary one, contingent on technology that had not been invented yet. The telegraph killed the courier advantage. The telephone killed the telegraph advantage. The internet killed the telephone advantage. Each generation of technology compresses the gap between first and second until the gap disappears entirely. Today, financial firms spend billions on infrastructure to gain advantages measured in milliseconds. High-frequency traders co-locate their servers next to exchange computers to shave microseconds off transaction times. The principle is identical to Nathan Rothschild's carrier pigeons. The scale is different. A 24-hour advantage becomes a 24-microsecond advantage. The logic is the same. Bloomberg terminals are the modern Rothschild network. Every trader sees the same data at the same time. The advantage now comes from interpretation, not transmission. First mover still matters, but first mover now means first to understand, not first to receive. The Rothschilds built something remarkable, a communications infrastructure that outpaced governments for decades, a financial network that stabilized currencies and funded wars, a family structure that distributed risk across borders before borders meant anything. But they built it for a specific world. A world of slow ships and slower bureaucracies, a world where information was scarce and speed was rare. When that world disappeared, their advantage disappeared with it. They didn't fail, they were outgrown. The systems they invented were adopted, institutionalized, and scaled beyond anything a family could manage. Central banks replaced private lenders. Telegraph companies replaced courier networks. Institutional investors replaced family capital. This is what conspiracy theories miss. The Rothschilds didn't lose power because someone stopped them. They lost power because the game changed. The infrastructure advantage they built was brilliant for its era and obsolete by the next one. Modern finance still runs on Rothschild principles. Speed matters. Information matters. Network effects create durable advantages. But those principles now belong to everyone. They are taught in business schools. They are coded into algorithms. They are the foundation of how markets work. The Rothschilds didn't control the world. They built systems that moved faster than governments, until governments built faster systems. That's not a conspiracy. That's capitalism. the same force that elevated them eventually replaced them. Their story isn't about secret power. It's about temporary power. The most important word in business isn't control, it's duration. How long can you maintain an advantage before someone else figures it out? For the Rothschilds, the answer was about 50 years. For the next family or firm or algorithm that builds a faster network, the answer might be 50 months or 50 days. The principle endures, the practitioners change. That's the real lesson of the House of Rothschild. Not that information is power, which everyone already knows, but that information advantages are temporary, which most people forget. Whatever edge you build today, someone is building a faster one tomorrow. The 5 arrows are still bound together. The family still operates banks in London and Paris, but they operate them as one firm among thousands, subject to the same rules, using the same tools, moving at the same speed as everyone else. The 19th century internet is a museum piece now. Its builders are historical figures. And the next advantage is already being constructed by people whose names we don't yet know, in systems we don't yet understand. The architecture of power never stops evolving. It just changes architects.